Hello everyone, Stepan here. I'll continue the series on the King's Gambit with the modern defense. We are still doing King's Gambit accepted. And the modern defense is the third most popular response to the King's Knight Gambit in the King's Gambit accepted. And I would say that it's far less dangerous for white than the Fisher defense, which we went over already, and the main move, which is g5. So in this position, in the King's Gambit, black accepts the gambit, e takes f4, and now white has two different moves. One of them is knight to f3, which the modern defense develops from, and the other one is bishop to c4, which we are going to go over in a separate video. But after e4, knight to f3, the main move is g5, the Fisher defense is d6, we went over that already, and the modern defense is the move d5. This move basically has in mind that black is willing to give back his extra pawn for compensation, or for, to gain even more compensation and to gain more central activity. So black is content to have equal material in many variations. And while the idea is sound, I think that g5 or d6 are far better options, and this shouldn't be a scary variation for the King's Gambit player to face. However, if you're not careful with the white pieces and you play the King's Gambit and you only prepare for the two main options, d6 or g5, then this could cost you dearly, because the modern defense could be quite tricky and dangerous for white. Now here, let's just get one thing out of the way. The move e5 isn't a good move, that should never be played, because now black switches plans to g5 and basically has a more favorable main line of the King's Gambit. So g5, d4 now if you want to defend, and now simply g4. And if I turn on the engine, this is just winning. This is -2, so bishop takes f4, gf3. You're basically forced to give up a piece. This is the best variation. If you don't play d4, then this is a permanent weakness. If after g4 you move your knight, then f3 is coming, so you can't play e5. So after d5, the only good move and the only move ever played is e takes d5. Now, in live book, there have been a lot of high-rated games. For example, Magnus Carlsen faced this position twice, once against Wang Yue in 2010 and once against Levon Aronian in 2015. You should check out that game, it ended in a draw. So it's a position, the modern defense is definitely a position that can be played on the highest level as well. After e takes d5, black has only one move, putting pressure on the d5 pawn, so knight to f6. And this is, if you count the material, white has regained his pawn, of course. Both sides now have 7 pawns, and d5, the modern defense, gives the pawn back immediately. After e takes d5, taking with the queen is sort of provoking knight to c3, so I wouldn't recommend this move. This isn't such a good move for black. So after e takes d5, the main move is knight to f6, similar to some positions in the Tarrasch French for white, where you don't go for your d4 pawn immediately, you don't go for taking the pawn immediately, you wait, you build up the pressure. So knight to f6, and here the position branches out. This is where white gets to decide what he's doing against the modern defense. And as I said, the modern defense isn't the trickiest line for white to face, and I think that once you see d5 on the board, you can be happy with the white pieces. You do, however, have to know a lot of variations. The good news for the player with the white pieces is that he gets to choose the variation. This is what you are going to see in every single game. If this doesn't happen, then either your opponent has prepared the trick so good that you're probably going to lose, or he doesn't know any theory and you're going to win easily. So the good news for the player with the white pieces is that he gets to choose how the position will develop from here on. The bad news for the player with the black pieces is that he gets to choose to play the modern defense, but he doesn't get to choose the variation. And that happens often. For example, if you play the French defense, after the two opening moves, then white can either choose the Tarrasch French, the exchange French, the advanced French, whatever. So you're basically giving white the option to choose. Now, there are 5 options. The main move is bishop to c4. This is the main move. The most popular sidelines are bishop to b5, c4, knight to c3, and bishop to e2. Bishop to e2 I find to be the most comfortable way to play for white. It's the least active way though, and we are going to go over each one. Let's go over bishop to e2 first. This is, as I said, the least popular sideline, and it's only been played about 20 or 30 times in Grandmaster games, but still it's a very valuable weapon to have against the modern defense, and I think that most players who play d5 will not be prepared for this. Here, white refused to defend his pawn once again, so you got your opponent attacked your pawn twice and you simply ignored it. Most of the other moves, bishop to c4, knight to c3, c4 defend the pawn directly, and bishop to b5 defends it indirectly because black has to react. So bishop to e2 is the only move that simply gives the pawn back, and black has to take it. So knight takes d5, bishop to e2, knight takes d5, and now you can either castle immediately or play actively, and now you actually are sort of managing to turn the tables on black, and now you've given some material once again. Black tried to do that, so first you played the king's gambit, then black played the modern defense, giving back the pawn. Now you gave the pawn back once again, and now you have the activity once again. So c4, chasing the knight away, knight to f6. Black can also play knight to b6, but that's slightly less active. Knight to b4 has also been played. I don't think that's a good move though, getting your knight back to c6. Knight to f6, and now d4, expanding in the center. Now once again the material, black is a pawn up, but now bishop b4 check by black. You block that with knight to c3 and castles. This position is in fact better for white. You have a huge center. The extra f4 pawn could have been taken right away instead of castles, but castles is more precise. Even the engines agree that this position is better for white. So one of the rare cases that straight out of the opening in the king's gambit accepted, white is slightly better, and I love this position for white. You do have hanging pawns here, because you are most probably going to have to face some sort of an attack, and you are going to have to recapture with the b pawn on c4, so you might end up with two hanging pawns on the d and c4 squares, but that will be okay. And yeah, you have basically more active pieces and the clear target on f4. g5 is not easy to play now because your king is already castled. So bishop to e2 is a very dangerous move for black to face, and I would recommend you research that. So after knight to f3, d5 the modern defense, e takes d5, knight to f6, the move bishop to e2, which is rarely played but leads to favorable positions for white. Of course, black would play more actively and play riskier moves, and then you have to figure out what to do over the board, but it's highly likely that you will get a position such as this one in which white basically has no problems and he's down an insignificant f4 pawn. Okay, after knight to f6, instead of bishop to e2, knight to c3 is the least popular sideline after that, simply defending your d pawn. And here the pawn was attacked twice, so you've defended it, but black gets to take it anyway. And you are, with the move knight to c3, you are provoking the queen into the center to be a tempo gain after d4, c4, and stuff like that. So here black captures, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, you play d4, expanding, attacking the f4 pawn. Bishop to e7, black tries to castle, bishop to d3. Taking on f4 could have been played, but you should really castle first. In all of these positions in the modern defense, just don't rush with taking the f4 pawn. Black has to castle kingside anyway, and you can take this pawn at your own leisure later on. If you take the pawn and don't put your king to safety on the g1 square, then you might be in trouble. So just develop and castle. g5 here. Black can try to defend, but you castle anyway. g4. Here, well, you could try playing c4. That's definitely a playable move, which ends up in a piece sacrifice. It goes like this. So here, the best move is actually to play d5 here and give up your knight. But as I said, I think it's far too risky. So I would recommend after castles g4 to simply play knight to e1 and you're fine. Black is slightly better, but he has overextended on the king side and a strong attack is nowhere in sight. You have both bishops defending the key diagonals. You have a very active knight defending your king. Your rook is around, your queen is around, and there's really no easy way for black to checkmate you. Black can of course take here, queen takes d4, but king to h1, queen to b6, because now we were threatening to take the queen. It was undefended with a check. And now let's say bishop to c4. The engines prefer white here. The engines think that white is slightly better, plus 0.2, 0.3. I, however, would rather have black because it's simply 2 pawns up and, well, it's material up. However, the engines like white, and they think that white's activity more than compensates for the 2 pawns, and I can understand that. So this is a perfectly playable position. Just remember this position. So knight c3, one response to the modern defense. Knight d5, knight d5, queen d5, d4 expanding, bishop e7, bishop d3, don't rush to take the f4 pawn, g5, if black tries to defend, that's okay, just castle, g4, c4 is playable if you want to give up a piece, remember that, but I would recommend the line knight to e1, and now queen takes d4, you don't care about that, just give the pawn. King h1, queen to b6. If black blunders, you will be super happy. Let's say black plays a stupid move, then this could be played, of course, and you can see that black is losing. But let's say he doesn't blunder, bishop to c4, you have a lot of activity and a perfectly playable position. So both moves, bishop to e2 and knight to c3, are perfectly playable, and in fact, with perfect play, lead to slightly better positions for white. Okay, after knight to f6, bishop to b5 and c4 are the two remaining sidelines I would like to cover, and then bishop c4, which is the main line. So let's go over c4 now. Defending your d5 pawn directly and saying to black, well, I sacrificed the pawn with the king's gambit, you gave it back, and, well, we're equal now. So you could argue who's better. The engines think the position is equal. Slightly better for black, but I would rather have black here. I think c4 is too weakening. You're making too many holes in the position, and I just don't like this. Too many weaknesses. Black continues with c6, d4, cd5. You can also, as black, choose to play bishop to b4 here, but it basically transposes. So cd5, bishop takes f4, bishop b4 check now, and now knight to c3 blocking, castles, bishop e2 preparing to castle. Once again, I really don't like this line with c4, even though it's the only move that directly defends the d5 pawn and the material is equal. Both sides have 6 pawns. I think black has a safer king, more active pieces and less weaknesses in the position. Let's say dc4 here, which is the main move, bishop c4, knight c6, castles. Well, you have an isolated d4 pawn. If you're comfortable playing with that, okay. Black doesn't really have such an easy way to blockade the pawn. However, knight e7, knight d5 might do the trick. So you might find yourself with an isolated pawn which will easily become a target. So from a human perspective, this is harder to play for white, and you can't really expect a position much better than this. Now, the engines think it's equal, but I prefer either knight c3 or bishop to e2 instead of c4. Okay, the second most popular move is bishop to b5 check, developing your piece with tempo and trying to castle as soon as possible. So definitely a sensible move. However, after the main reply c6, with which black is basically giving the pawn back permanently, so now we are going to have equal material definitely after dc6, knight c6. Both sides have 6 pawns and white in fact has a better pawn structure. This is a very sensible idea, and when I started analyzing the modern defense, I thought I would definitely go for bishop to b5, because if you don't play c6, then it's not really clear what black does after bishop to b5. In live book, after bishop to b5, c6 has been played almost 150 times, bishop to d7 has only been played 10 times, and white has won a majority of these games. So bishop to d7 isn't really such a good move. If bishop to d7, then you can either play bishop back to c4 or bishop takes d7. I think bishop to c4 is better. So yeah, the engines think that taking is a better move, but bishop to c4 is fine as well. Let's say you take here. I would guess you take with the knight and castles. You can see that white is fine here, and white has a safer position in this line, and white actually has a lead in development, and as black you really don't want that to happen in the king's gambit. So Bishop to b5, c6, the main move, giving back the pawn permanently. dc6, knight c6. White continues with d4, expanding in the center, threatening in some positions after knight c3 to play d5. Bishop d6, castles, castles, c4. The engines prefer black. I think white is perfectly fine, and I would actually love to have white in this position. Equal material, a weakness on f4, a perfect bishop on b5, which you can in some positions exchange for the c6 knight and create a weakness on c6. Central control with the c and the d pawns, a beautiful knight on f3, just a fine position. Black usually continues with a6, bishop c6, bc6, and c5. This is the main move, and although it's counterintuitive to create a weakness on d4, I can understand it because the bishop doesn't really have that many squares. And you want your knight to get to e5. And this is where the position branches out far too much, and I would actually... if you decide to play the line with bishop to b5 check, this is where I would start my analysis. If I were you, I would get this position on the board and just assess it. So what do we have? Both sides have 6 pawns. Both sides have 3 minor pieces. Black, however, has the bishop pair, which might give him a slight edge. On the other hand, black has a horrible pawn structure. Black has 3 isolated pawns and 1 set of doubled pawns, so any endgame will be better for white. So in general, as white, you would like to keep your pawn structure intact and exchange as many pieces as possible. That would be my starting point. So the main continuation here with c5, I'm not sure I would play it, even though I knew over the board that that was theory. So bishop c7, knight e5 is the main line. You're allowing black to ruin your pawn structure as well. Knight to d5, knight c3. Knight takes c3, bc3, bishop e5, d5. I don't like this position. I would rather, after bc6, just continue normally, perhaps even play b3, bishop b2, try to go for d5, and stuff like that. But a perfectly playable position in any case. Okay, and after knight to f6, the main line is bishop to c4, defending your pawn, and the idea is the same, is similar as with knight to c3. You're provoking the queen to the center, but in this line, after knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, you have knight to c3 chasing the queen away with tempo. So here the main move is knight takes d5. As white, you can either take immediately or castle. Taking with the bishop is a sideline, which I think is slightly inferior to the main line. Queen takes d5, knight c3, queen d8, d4, bishop b4 castles. It can transpose, but there are some differences. Black can ruin your pawn structure here as well. And that's why after knight takes d5, I prefer the move castles. It's a playable position. I mean, black has an extra pawn, once again a weakness on f4, which you can exploit. Black has 1 piece developed, so a definite lead in development for white. If you count the development 1, 2, and white has 1, 2, 3 pieces developed, and I think the lead in development more than compensates for the weak f4 pawn. The position continues with bishop to e6 or bishop to e7. Bishop to e6 is probably a better move, just over protecting your knight and preparing to capture with the bishop so that you don't lose time with knight to c3. But bishop to e7 is playable as well. Here the position continues with d4, castles, bishop d5, queen d5, bishop f4. You can also play knight c3, but I think bishop to f4 is more precise because it might be really hard to regain your pawn after knight c3, queen to d6. Now you already have to worry about black keeping that pawn. So queen takes d5, I would recommend bishop takes f4, and now c6 is the main move, knight c3, queen a5. Slightly better for white here, in my opinion, and in the engine opinion, but an equal position. Black has the bishop pair, white has a lead in development, playable for both sides. The main line, however, after castles is bishop to e6, and now bishop b3, because you don't want to risk any tactics. Let's say the bishop has remained here. Let's say white plays something ridiculous. Black would continue with a move such as this one, and after takes, takes here, takes here, takes here, you might win the bishop pair that way. I'm not saying this is good, just an example. So the main move of the bishop to e6 is bishop to b3. Bishop e7, now developing the other bishop, c4, chasing the knight away, knight b6. The knight can also go to f6. I just think that b6 is more precise. d4, expanding in the center, and you can already see that white has something for his pawn. I mean, black still has the extra pawn, but these pawns are very nice in the center, and in conjunction with the two bishops, with the knight on f3 and with the queen that can easily get active, I think that black's king is in far more danger, and that black is the one who could go wrong in many lines. Knight takes c4 is the main move, taking the opportunity to grab the pawn. Knight c3, knight b6 back, d5 expanding, bishop g4, bishop takes f4, castles. This is sort of the starting position, and if I turn on the engine, they actually prefer white by half a pawn. I wouldn't say that's an objective assessment. I think it's plausible, but I think that the position is equal. So yeah, this is sort of the starting position of the main line of the modern. Remember this position, study it, learn how to play with an isolated queen's pawn. That could happen often out of the modern defense. Learn how to play with hanging pawns. That could also be a common theme in the opening. And yeah, I would recommend studying some Grandmaster games in these lines. You can find them in the live book, and I hope you enjoyed the position. Once again, not the perfect defense for black, but as white, as a King's Gambit player, you need to be prepared. The good news that you get to choose the line. Once again, let's go over the opening. So e4, e5, King's Gambit accepted, knight f3, d5, the modern defense, e d5, a forced move, knight f6, a forced move. White could either play bishop c4, bishop b5 check, c4 defending the pawn, knight to c3, or bishop to e2. I prefer the move bishop to e2 personally. I think it's a very fine approach to the position. Okay, everybody, I hope you liked the video. I hope you got something from it, and that you learned another defense to the King's Gambit. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.